So this week at EICMA, MV Agusta announced something pretty different. It's a pair of brand new adventure bikes as part of their Lucky Explorer project. They're inspired by the Dakar Rally Racing Kajiba Elephant in its Lucky Explorer livery, but does this first stab at the modern adventure bike market live up to the name and legend? Well, in this video, we'll go over all of the details of each bike and find out. But look, let me say, the big one, the 9.5, it looks pretty good. But first up, the 5.5, which is built in partnership with the Chinese manufacturer QJ. They're also responsible for bikes under the Benelli brand. This one's an A2 license-friendly small to mid-capacity adventure bike, and it's powered by a 554cc liquid-cooled parallel twin, which they say has undergone specific refinement aimed at further improving the high efficiency. So it's not going to be an out-and-out powerful beast, but built with frugality and cost-effectiveness in mind. They're claiming 47 horsepower peak at 7,500 RPM and 51 Nm of peak torque at 5,500 RPM, so both figures are pretty respectable, although at 220 kilograms dry, it's not exactly a featherweight. So despite being relatively modest in performance, it does have a few things going for it. Firstly, it looks like it should have plenty of that big bike feel, which should contribute to decent comfort for long distance riding. The seat height is 860mm, for example, which is a strong indication that it isn't going to feel cramped. You've got what looks like a decent saddle and plenty of space for a passenger. It's got handguards, an adjustable windscreen from the looks of it, and even a rail for mounting accessories like a sat-nav. On top of that, it gets a 20-litre tank, which is much bigger than you'd expect to find on a bike at this capacity. It sips fuel at just 3.8 litres consumed per 100 kilometers, and so at that quoted figure, you should get just over 500 kilometers, which is equivalent to just over 300 miles, 326 to be precise. So that's bags of range and probably more than any of the competition. Take the Honda CB500X for example, that's got a 17.7 litre tank. But I think the rest of the spec is a lot more premium, and so realistically it's going to sit at a very different price point to the CB500X. You've got a pair of radially mounted 4-pot Brembo brake calipers for example, and they clamp down on 320mm discs. You also get a 2-pot Brembo caliper at the rear. Suspension sounds decent as well, with a 43mm upside down KYB fork, and that's got preload and rebound adjustment, and then there's a KYB shock which is fully adjustable, so rebound, compression and preload. It also gets a 5-inch TFT display, and that's got Bluetooth connectivity, a GPS sensor, and then you can use the MV Ride app to enable turn-by-turn navigation. As for rider aids, they only list Bosch ABS, but you'd imagine it'll have more, as that sort of goes hand in hand with the TFT dash and stuff. Either way, it looks like it'll be miles ahead of something like the Honda. Looks wise as well, it's got a little bit more flair than the Honda. I mean, obviously it has something in common with the Benelli TRK 502X, which it has shared components with, but I like the Lucky Strike inspired paint scheme and the Africa Twin inspired headlights, I guess. You've got a 19-inch front for a bit more of that adventure look, and I also like those brake disc covers. No price as of yet, I don't think, but it'll certainly be at the more premium end of the spectrum than the Benelli or the Honda, which come in at just either side of $6,000. Hopefully not too much more though, because once you get to 8 or 9,000, there are some very tempting and more powerful bikes on offer, like the Tenere 700. But the main course in this two-wheel meal is undoubtedly the 9.5. This is a proper middleweight adventure bike, so it'll go directly head-to-head with the likes of the Triumph Tiger 900, BMW F850 GS, the KTM 890, and of course the Husky Norden 901. Now the engine for this bike is somewhat derived from the 800cc inline triple that they use in their Dragster, Brutale, Turismo Veloce, F3 and Super Veloce. But they say that they made a bunch of changes to find the right balance of versatility and power, which make it more appropriate for adventure bike use. They say that most of the components are new, so a new cylinder head, new steel intakes and exhaust valves, a new crankshaft, new conrod bearings, and new pistons, and both bore and stroke have been increased, taking the total displacement up from 800 to 930cc, and the result is 123 horsepower peak at 10,000 RPM and 102 Nm of peak torque at 7,000 RPM. Pretty impressive figures, and certainly a bit more than something like the Tiger 900, which uses a similarly sized inline triple. That bike makes 94 horsepower peak and 87 Nm of peak torque. Interesting that Triumph went down the T-plane crank route on the Tiger 900, and I think the new Tiger 1200, which is coming out soon. The basic idea is that the evenly spaced triple cylinder engine that was on the Tiger 800 was too smooth and revvy, and so when it came to off-road road use, lower in the rev range, it didn't really have that torquey feel that you get from a twin like the KTM and the BMW and even the Africa Twin. So they increased the interval between two of the cylinders in the firing order there, just to give it a bit more of that twin feel, and then it seems like MV, they've ignored that. This is 120 degrees between each cylinder on the crank, so even spacing, very much like the Tiger 800, but with a bit more capacity and revs. So yeah, obviously the MV engineers don't rate the T-plane crank, or Triumph have got a patent on it or something. Another thing that came as a bit of a surprise was the offer of 3 gearbox configurations. So you've got a normal regular hydraulic clutch with the usual shifter peg, and then as with many other MV Agustas, the second option would be a recluse clutch. So that engages automatically as you twist the throttle, and then you've still got a clutch lever and shifter peg to use, and you can just feather the clutch when you need it. Both of those will be offered with a quick shifter, but the third main option is what they're calling a cyborg electric actuated gearbox. I guess this will give you something similar to the dual clutch transmission you find in some of Honda's bikes, including the Africa Twin. You can put it in an automatic mode and it basically shifts gears for you, or you can use the buttons on the switchgear to select a gear manually. This sounds a little more simple though, so instead of 2 clutches and 2 sets of gears like you get on the DCT, it sounds like this will be something that, you know, actually just shifts the peg for you and you'll control it with the buttons on the switchgear. I'm not sure if it'll have an automatic mode, but yeah, very interesting. You see mods like this, like kits that are available for disabled riders perhaps who don't have full use of their left foot, and so clearly MV have seen the DCT as something that's desirable on the Africa Twin but sought a more simple, cost-effective solution to deliver a similar sort of outcome. This is the first bike they fitted it to, so perhaps it's a bit of a test and we'll see it rolling out to more bikes in future. Now it gets a steel frame with twin beams and a bolt-on double cradle, a steel trellis subframe and an aluminium swing arm. They've managed to keep the weight pretty reasonable when you set it against the 5.5, so it's the same 220 kilograms dry. Not bad, but I think it still comes in a little more than some of the competition. Seat height is adjustable between 850 and 870 mils, so it's going to feel similar in stance to that smaller sibling, but just with a lot more power and spec. Take the suspension for example, you get a 50mm upside down Sachs fork, but it's fully adjustable using electronic adjustment. There's also an electronically adjustable Sachs monoshock, but there's no word on whether it'll be semi-active, so reading the riding conditions and riding style, or whether you can just choose from a few presets through the TFT and the switchgear. There's 220mm of travel at the front and 210 at the rear, so a reasonable amount should you wish to take it off-road. The wheel sizes should also help, so you get an 18-inch at the rear and a 21 up front. That should allow for easier rolling over rough surfaces, but also a good choice of off-road focused tyres. Brakes are also from Brembo, but with their top-notch Stylema calipers on 320mm discs at the front and a single pot caliper also from Brembo on a 265mm disc at the rear. And the spec sheet reveals that the ABS system will be provided by Continental and includes both their rear wheel lift control but also a cornering function, so it's safe to assume there's a 6-axis IMU on board, and that'll feed lean data into a bunch of other riding modes like traction control and wheelie control. This bike gets their 7-inch TFT display with both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connectivity, and you also get cruise control, launch control, cornering LED headlights, and connectivity with the MV Ride app to manage the bike's settings. So pretty comprehensive and definitely up there with the competition in terms of the latest and greatest of tech available in the adventure market. Comfort-wise, this bike looks decent as well, so we can see handguards, a fairly substantial windscreen, plenty of protection from the bodywork, and what looks like a fairly comfortable saddle, although these things really do have to be measured with a properly good date in the saddle, and I am selflessly willing to volunteer myself for such a task. As for styling, it has a lot in common with the 5.5, but just looks that little bit more premium in the design work. I think I prefer these headlights because they're less of a direct rip-off of the Africa Twin, but I also like the paintwork and I like the use of carbon fiber around the sump guard and across the tank. Just reminds you that it's still an MV Agusta despite the knobbly tyres. Again, no price on this one yet, but it'll be interesting to see whether they try to bother to compete on price. They don't normally with their nakeds and sports bikes. I mean, they're generally at the top end of the market and that's almost their selling point, the exclusivity. But you'd expect that they're making an adventure bike to try and shift a few more units. That's certainly the case with the 5.5 8.5 being built by QJ, but what about this bike, the 9.5? It's similar in spec to something like the Tiger 900 Rally Pro. It does have more power and you'd probably say more flair in the design. And so with the Triumph starting at over 13 grand, you'd expect this one to maybe come in at 14 or 15, perhaps even more. As always, I'd love to know what you think of it down in the comments below. On the spec sheet, it looks pretty awesome and I can't really find any massive weaknesses, but I guess you always need the context of price in order to gauge that properly. A good first attempt by MV, or would you go for something else? Let me know down in the comments, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you next time.